Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Swati Biswas from the Department of Islamic History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today we are going to discuss from the paper Economic History of India from earliest to 1707 AD and from the module Delhi Sultanate, Industry, Trade and Commerce. Our main objective to understand this model is the new non-agrarian units during Delhi Sultanate, the producers of these units, the merchants involved in these units, the role of the state, the role of the intermediaries and new business class, and the general scenario of the trade and commerce during Sultanate period. Now, coming to the industry, there is no direct source from the contemporary period which would refer about the non-agrarian production of the time. Thus, the mineral and craft production of the period remains shrouded in mystery and the information is gathered in scattered form from diverse sources. But these sources cannot be verified at all. Now, moving on to the crafts and textiles, the first important industry of the time. This is considered to be the largest industry of the time, and this industry was revolutionized by certain technological changes. The use of the spinning wheels resulted in a larger production of textile. From the sources of Isami, it is referred that the spindle for the first time was referred in case of Razia Sultana. He asked the empress to use the spindle instead of ruling the empire in 1350. So therefore, this is the first reference to this technological change, and we understand that this may have been the mode for use of women at home. The spindle came to India with the Muslims, and by 14th century it almost revolutionized the production by 6 times. The cotton carded bow also reached India with the Ghorian conquest, and there is no mention of this instrument earlier to this. The Persian world knew the use of it in the 11th century while it reached Europe in the 14th century. The use of both these instruments enhanced the production of fine cotton and cheapened the cotton spun. Not much is known regarding the use of weaver's loom or something called kargha. The Mughal horizontal looms may have been introduced later. It is though well known that treadles were introduced to the loom during the early medieval period. The number of weavers should have increased with large amount of cotton spun available. Thus, the per capita consumption of clothing for common man increased from the earlier period. Now, there is also very limited source regarding the information of types of textile. There were many names and it is very difficult to ascertain the type of clothes. There were mere names of some of the clothes and the detail of it is very difficult to ascertain. Poor people wore coarse cloth which was known as kamina cloth or also known as pat. The coarser cloth was supplied from areas in Delhi like Ayodhya or Awadh. Calico or karpas is another type of finer cloth, but it is very difficult to ascertain where this cloth came from. There is also mention of Silat muslin or also known as shinabaft or salabati. These were the finer cloths used by the upper class of Delhi. Bhairo and Devagiri also supplied muslin, which was of fine quality and definitely owned by royalty and the nobles. Bengal exported large quantity of muslin. From the sources of Mahuan, it is known in 1432 that a variety of clothes were produced in Bengal and exported. Only 2 varieties could be identified. One is Shanabaf, a very fine cotton, another a bit coarser known as chautar. Marco Polo's account also refers to fine cloths, especially cotton from Gujarat. Marco Polo refers to cotton and silk mixed cloth known as jarj or mushroom. It is not known from where the silk has arrived. Raw silk or abrasham was imported from Afghanistan and Iran. Silk weaving reached excellence in Gujarat, and a complex design of patola was very famous and highly prized. It is known that Alauddin Khalji confiscated a lot of these patola when he actually was controlling Gujarat. So patola was an item that would have been used by the upper class and kept as a treasure. Marco Polo also mentions about gold and silver embroidery from Gujarat. No other source, of course, refers to these kind of embroidery, which later became very popular in India. Shawls from Kashmir were already popular, and sources earlier to Delhi Sultanate knew about this weaving process. It is known that the Tughlaqs also used to send these shawls through the ambassadors into the foreign land. The dyeing method, of course, of the period is not known. The tie and dye method already existed before the advent of the Turks. The printing method are also not known because no sources refer to printing prior to 15th century. There was technique of cloth painting but of course this technique is much ancient to India and could not have been produced in large scale. Now this is an industry which used different kinds of labor, but most of the labor came from the household because the spinning was actually done by the women in the household and then it was moved to the market. But of course, from the first to the end product, various kinds of hired labor could have been used. Spinning was done at home, it is true, but it is also, one has to understand that the karkhanas had special laborers who could be involved in spinning. Weavers usually worked at home, wage-based labor, the concept was becoming popular. The karkhanas perhaps only produce expensive clothes as far as the sources are concerned. Umari refers to 4,000 workers producing silk robes and garments in the karkhanas of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Firoz Tughlaq's karkhanas produced clothes worth 6 lakh tankas every winter. So therefore, the royal karkhanas also had a viable market and may have exported these items to the foreign land. According to Siraj-us-Safif, carpets worth 2 lakh tankas were produced annually during Firoz Tughlaq. The cheapest mineral, moving on to the minerals now, the cheapest was of course salt. Siraj-us-Safif refers to Sambhar Lake, which was the largest producer of salt in North India. Now let's move on to another very important industry, that is mining. Now it is believed that salt is the cheapest mineral that was produced at that point of time. Siraj-us-Safif refers to the Sambhar Lake, which may have been the largest supplier of salt. The word namak is synonymous to Sambhar. The contemporary sources, of course, later do not mention this lake anymore. The second information comes from the time of Abul Fazl or the Mughals, and it is written extensively about Sambhar Lake. So therefore, between Yuan Sang and the accounts of Abul Fazl must have, that is the period of Delhi Sultanate, salt may have and should have been produced in Sambhar Lake. But of course, salt also falls under a very important export item as referred in the sources. Umari's account refers to high quality iron ore mined in India. We have to understand that this change in the quality and quantity of iron ore definitely brought about a change and revolutionized the production level in India. There was a major source of Damascene steel which has hit international demand, and it was one of the items that was exported by the royalty. The mines extended from Gwalior to South India. Fakhr-e-Mudabbir refers to the Karaji swords, which were a speciality from the Kutch region. It is known from the Ganiza record that iron was exported to Middle East in the 10th and 11th century and continued till the time of Delhi Sultanate. Mining areas were referred even in the account of Abul Fazl and later in the 17th century records. Now moving to the other metals, copper, silver and gold. Now India definitely used huge amount of copper, gold and silver, but it is also believed that it never produced that amount of copper, silver or gold because the mines were limited and were not enough to supply to the market. Rajasthan may have supplied copper during the time, but of course no sources very firmly confirm this. The later Mughal records refer to the Rajasthan supplying copper. India produced very limited silver. Certain parts of Karnataka did supply silver, but that was not enough as the main base of the currency was silver. And therefore, India was one of the largest importers of silver. River sands produced gold, but of course one has to understand that that gold was not sufficient for the market demand. Arabic sources from Wasif and Umari refers India as a land which imported large quantities of silver and gold. Marco Polo refers interestingly to the diamond industry of Deccan. Masari Mahmud Shabi informs that diamond was also mined in Gondwana in the 15th century, but of course these mines were later producing very little diamond worth mentioning. There is no reference of Kalinjar mines which was mentioned largely in the Mughal accounts. Marco Polo in his account mentions about pearl industry in the Tuticorin areas of South India, but it is difficult to ascertain as to the amount of pearl produced in this industry. The second largest industry apart from textile in Delhi Sultanate was the building industry. One has to understand that with the advent of the Delhi Sultans, urbanization moved to a new phase. And this new urbanization needed the building of new cities, and that led to the flourishing of building industry. Building industry attracted laborers from the rural area to the urban centers and involved them in batches. Building industry was a part of the Islamic culture which reached India through the culture of urban centers. The Saracenic architectural taste was added to this phase of urbanization. The dome, the true arch, the wall system gave a new look to the roofing of the buildings. The technique was quickly adopted by the laborers and the architects of India. Added to this was the extensive use of the lime mortar as a cementing material. The rich and the middle class started living in houses made of bricks or stone, which was built by large-scale laborers. Urbanization gave a rise to new mosques, forts, palaces involving these large laborers who moved from the rural area to the urban centers. If Barani is to be relied, then Alauddin Khalji employed 70,000 laborers to build his building alone in the capital city. Tughlaqs were also great builders, and their new capital involved large section of these laborers. We also have to understand that when Babur came to India after the Delhi Sultanate was down, he mentioned about employing 500,000 stone cutters alone in the areas around Delhi. Indian swords reached a new height with an extensive technological change in metallurgy. So therefore, this urbanization also gave space to factories which would encourage metallurgy. Indian swords were considered the best in the world and was one of the important export items from India. Fakhri-e-Mudabbir refers to the Damascene swords which was famous throughout the world, and it even reached Europe from India. The Gurji swords from the Kutch were also very popular, but they had only Asiatic use. There was another soft sword made of alloy of iron, copper and silver mentioned by Sirajuz Afif. But of course, this is not being able to corroborate it by any other source. In Deccan, bronze and brass industry flourished, and Geniza records show that copper and zinc were regularly imported for these two industries. Interestingly, a lot of items were sent for repair in this area from the Mediterranean. Utensils were made of alloys and orders came from far as Aden. The fine metallic coins also testify to the fact that metallurgy reached new heights during this period. Another interesting industry was the paper industry, which for the first time saw its beginning in the time of Delhi Sultanate. Paper industry was very new and it revolutionized the book production in India. With the advent of Delhi Sultanate, one has to understand that India became a part of Islamic culture where book was a prized possession and a very, very important item of export and import. It was used not before 13th century. The first used paper came from Gujarat in 1223-24, and Barani refers to papers being washed and reused. But of course, later paper was produced in such quantity and fine quality that the reusing of paper was not very popular. It is said that the sweet makers of Delhi during the time of Delhi Sultanate, even during the early part of Delhi Sultanate, used paper packets for their sweets. The new book industry flourished to produce a new group of professionals known as scribes and nasaks. And employing a nasak was an expensive affair during this time. Now let's move on to the trade and commerce from industry. Now, during Delhi Sultanate, a resurgence of town was a phenomenon. This in turn gave boost to craft production, as we have already discussed. During Alauddin Khalji's rule, the insistence on cash payment for revenue became conducive to inland trade. Rural products were sold to the market for cash, and it then resulted in what is known as inducive trade. The supply to the town was one way. Due to the tax structure, the balance of payment was such that it always favored the towns, and thus there was no need for items moving from urban centers to rural areas. Crops usually moved from rural areas to the urban areas. So it was a one-way movement. It actually involved a large amount of bulk movement, but it resisted a large amount of cash movement from urban areas to the rural areas. The towns remained heavily dependent on the villages and thus resulted in the drain of rural sector. The turnover was large in volume and remained low in value. The villages mostly supplied food grain and cotton. With the development of new towns and development of communication system of these new towns, the older ones, high value trade was encouraged. Luxury items from one urban center to the other moved on regular basis. According to Ziauddin Barani, Delhi received wine from coal, which is also known as Aligarh, and Meerut in just 24 days. Devagiri supplied muslin and stripped cloth from Bengal or Lakhnavati. Ibn Battuta in his accounts informed that capital received ordinary cloth from Awadh and bitter leaf from Malwa. Delhi and Lahore supplied candy sugar to Multan and clarified butter or ghee or supplied by Sirsa and Haryana to the capital and adjoining areas. Areas like Multan and Cambay received overland and overseas trade goods to be re-exported or supplied to the inland towns. Broach and Cambay were also very popular centers for exchange of goods. One has to understand that India was very strategically placed, so the goods from China moved to Europe through India, and where in India certain places exchange of goods became one of the most important business of that time. Ibn Battuta claims that Delhi was perhaps the largest city in Asia and Daulatabad or Devagiri in South India was very close second. The two urban centers were popular trade junctions along with other cities like Multan mentioned earlier and Lahore and Bhilwara or Patan in Gujarat and Lakhnavati or Bengal. The fate of the cities of course fluctuated. It is referred that Siraj-u-Safif, Lahore was devastated after the Mongol attack in 1241, but again came back to its earlier position in the late 13th and early 14th century. Likewise, Lahore also was attacked many a times to come back to become one of the most important urban centers. It is believed that Multan revived during the time of Firoz Tughlaq as known from his account. Delhi had a large horse market, interestingly, and a slave market. Mahru claims that Khorasani merchants prayed to the Sultan that they will levy the tax after their arrival at Delhi and not at Multan. So this concept of exchange also existed for trades in horses or slaves. Commerce in horses extended up to Bengal. Minhaj-ul-Siraj informs that when Ikhtiaruddin Bakhtiyar Khalji came to conquer Bengal, or rather capture Bengal, everybody thought him and mistook him for a horse trader. Bengal exported muslin and later silk in exchange of horses from the Himalayan areas, which were perhaps superior breed of horses from southwest China and not Himalayan ponies as it was earlier believed. So therefore, these items brought larger share of money to these areas. In case of foreign trade, both overseas and overland trade flourished during this time. After the annexation of Gujarat, Delhi Sultanate was directly connected to the Persian Gulf and Red Sea through this trade. Sources suggest that Gujarat had regular trade with Hormuz and Basra along with Aden, Mocha and Jeddah. Through these ports, goods from Gujarat could move up to Damascus and Aleppo and Alexandria. These goods were then even ready to move to Europe through Mediterranean Sea. Gujarat also had trade relations with Malacca Strait and Indonesian archipelago. Gujarat was popular for exporting colored clothes, but of course there is no mention of printed cloth at all. Clothes were bartered for spices this time, and the barter system continued till the advent of the Portuguese in certain parts of Gujarat. Varthama, an Italian traveler, informs that in first decade of the 16th century, almost 300 ships plied from Cambay. He also informs about 400 Turkish merchants who would live in and around the area of Diu. Persia exported 10,000 horses annually to the Malabar and Cambay. Famous brooch coin hoards contain gold and silver coins from Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Persia, Genoa, Armenia, and as far as Venice. This gives an idea of the trading activity of the period during Delhi Sultanate. Bengal was also connected through ports to China, Malacca, and Far East. Bengal was popular for export items like textile, sugar, and later silk fabrics, as records claim that Hormuz imported salt to Bengal. Seashells or cowries, which were a means of exchange, also was supplied to the Bengal through Malabar Islands. One has to understand that a cowrie being an exchange item or exchange of a cash nexus only existed in Bengal and nowhere else in the country. Overseas trade also flourished in Sindh, and Daibul was an important port of the area. The area was closely linked to the Persian Gulf. Daibul was also a very important port where exchanges from different ships took place. Sindh exported cloth and dairy product. A faint mention of smoked fish as an item of export is known, but this is doubtful during that period. Coastal trade from Sindh via Gujarat up to Bengal became very active through Malabar and Coromandel coast. This gave a boost to interregional trade. Multan was a major center for overland trade in the 13th and 14th century. The Multan-Quetta route connected India to Afghanistan and Persia through roads. This route traded mostly in horses and precious metals. Horses were supplied to India from Yemen to Zofar, Kis, Hormuz, Aden, and Persia. Silver was in high demand for currency in India, apart from its use in luxury goods. Special brocade and silk was imported from China, Alexandria, Iraq, and Gujarat, and was the entry point for these luxury goods from Europe. India was a major supplier of food grains to Persian region. The agricultural boom in the country definitely made India one of the largest exporters of food grain to Middle East, and perhaps this food grain moved up to Europe. Cheap textile was also exported from India and had a larger market in the Persian Gulf. Slaves were exported to Central Asia. Indigo was another imported item for export. Precious stones like agate regularly moved from Gujarat to the Persian Gulf region and had a wider market in Europe. The sources regarding merchants is also very limited, but we find different kinds of merchants plying in this trade. The sources mention that the merchants were known as Karwanis or the Multanis. Ziauddin Barani refers to Karwanis or something called Nayaks as merchants who would trade only in food grain. They moved in large numbers. The head of the group was perhaps called the Nayak, a term which was later not much in use in case of merchants. They may be the predecessors of later what we know as Banjaras. They operated even during the time of the Mughals. Nasiruddin Chirag of Delhi mentions them as people who brought food to the capital. Multanis were engaged in long distance trade in group. They were involved in money lending also and general trade, which usually involved large amount of money. Another term was sahus, that was also referred to the Multanis. The term sood for the first time was used for interest and was an adjoining term for the sahus. So therefore, sahus are referred as the big merchants or the bankers. Later, of course, during the Mughal period, sahus were referred to only merchants who would deal in smaller items or goods. Ibn Battuta refers sahus as the bankers of Daulatabad. Their parallel could have been found in Egypt, which is known as Karims or Akarims. Karims and Akarims also worked in group. But of course, we have to understand that in India, the merchants worked in a group because of not the class position, but because of the class solidarity. Mostly Multanis were Hindus, but of course, Muslims were also involved in this trade and were called Multanis. Barani mentions about a big merchant or Malik ut-Tujar named Hamiduddin Multani. He was made the chief Qazi by Alauddin Khalji as a token of respect. Alauddin Khalji made an attempt to reduce the price of the luxury items in Delhi, and in order to ensure the supply, he gave 20 lakh of rupees to these Multani merchants. But of course, Multanis off and on received these kind of favors from the government. They also were in a position to lend money to the nobles who were always in crisis because of the fluctuating revenue. Ziauddin Barani also refers to a Sufi sect who was involved in slave merchants. Some of the Sufi sects perhaps allowed their members to be involved in such trade because it was very, very lucrative. Apart from these big merchants, smaller merchants also traded and sometimes acted as middlemen. There is also evidence which shows that pious men from Central Asia became merchants in India because it was very lucrative. Brokers or dalals, as they were known, were another group of men very essential to the trade of the time. They were essentially middlemen who would negotiate between a buyer and a seller. They operated in large numbers in the urban centers, especially in the capital. Now, they for the first time appeared in the trade and commerce scenario of India during Delhi Sultanate. They served not only as a link but also were involved sometimes in local politics, and they controlled the market according to Ziauddin Barani. And they were known as the Hakiman Bazaris or the key brokers. They had to be controlled by Alauddin Khalji as they mischievously hiked the prices of the commodities during his reform. They again gained their importance during the time of Tughlaqs, and the tax on the brokers during this time, known as Dalati Bazara, was abolished, and they even refused to pay back their commission if their deal failed. So, whenever the center was very strict and strong, their position deteriorated, but with the relaxation of the centers, the dalal became very, very important and the key role player in case of exchange. Sarafs were another group of merchants referred in the sources who dealt with money and the trading business. They fixed the exchange ratio with the foreign merchants, and they testified the metallic value of the foreign coins. Saraf issued hundis or letters of credit and acted as bankers. The introduction of paper after the advent of the Turks facilitated the process of the sarafs, and the charges they levied were pretty high, but of course it was not that the merchants of that time could not pay. The means of transport essentially was bullocks, as bullock carts were more expensive, and because of the availability of bullocks. It was the preferred item for bulk goods. Ibn Battuta refers to 30,000 grains carried by 3,000 bullocks from Amroha to Delhi. Sirajus Afif also refers to bullock carts carrying passengers in the exchange of money between urban centers. The use of back oxen was the cheapest means of transport, but of course a very slow mean. Now let's move on to the state effort in this trade and commerce. The Arabic account of Shahabuddin al-Umari refers that trade was a priority of the rulers, and thus every effort was given to enhance trade of the merchants who played a key role in the process. One has to understand the karkhanas of the royalty were also important exporters of items. So there has to be a control over the market through the royal machinery. Most of the rulers built sarais or inns for the merchants. Delhi Sultanate ensured that highways cut across the length and breadth of the empire remained safe and secure for the merchants. Minarets were built to enhance security through vigil. The rich merchants rode horses, and therefore a special care was taken to see that they securely moved from one part of the state to the other. Long embankments in Bengal was also constructed to combat flood during the time of Ivar's Khalji. So the local rulers also were involved in this trade and commerce. The system had barids or spies on horseback or on foot to inform the center in case of anything that seemed to be reported. A rudimentary postal system was in vogue, and the marketplaces exchanged letters as informed by Nizami. The bulk goods travels less roads compared to the expensive luxury goods which travel long distance. The increase in the coin hoards post 1200 testifies to the fact that trade flourished in India after the advent of the Turks. Coined money increased in its usage, circulation increased in the first half of this 14th century due to the flourishing of this trade. Now, let us summarize what we have discussed. The surplus from the agrarian produce gave boost to the non-agrarian production. The new rulers and the renewed urbanization was congenial for the industry. The non-agrarian produce paved the way for flourishing trade and commerce, and the new empire of Delhi Sultanate all was favorable for this new trade and commerce. Inland and oval trade flourished, and the subcontinent became a part of the larger international market for exchange of goods and favorable export and import. Thank you for this patient listening, and you can refer to the e-text for further information.